Between the night of June 22nd, 1991 and the morning of June 23rd, a series of strange and unbelievable events occurs that leaves one woman dead and her son the prime suspect. This is the case of Dorothy Donovan. Charles Holden lived in a trailer on the same property as his mother's house. Charles had just gotten off of work at the factory that he worked at, and he had stopped by a Hardee's to pick up some food on his way home. As he walked back to his car, he was approached by a man who asked him for a ride to another town. Now, Charles told this man that he wasn't going that far, but the man still insisted. So Charles said that he could drive him a few miles down the road, but that was it. So he gave this man a ride, and then he drove him a few miles down the road, and he was at an intersection where he would turn to typically head towards home off of this main road. Now, he said that at this point, he asked the man to get out of the car. He said that this was as far as he could take him, and this is when the hitchhiker got violent. He demanded that Charles take him to the town that he's going to, take him all the way to his destination, and he picked up a screwdriver and started attacking Charles in his own car. They both ended up getting out of the car at some point, and the man continued to threaten and intimidate Charles, and at one point Charles decided that he would tell the man he would take him to his destination. Now, as they walked back to the car, Charles was able to get into the car first, and then he locked the doors and he drove away, leaving the hitchhiker stranded at the intersection. He was really shaken up about the entire encounter, very understandably, and he decided that he was going to drive around for a few minutes before he went home because he didn't want to lead the hitchhiker back towards his house so that the hitchhiker could continue to take out any sort of violence against him, against his mom. So he decided to drive around for a few minutes. It had been 20 minutes before he got back to his house, and when he pulls up, he sees a man prowling around the outside of his mother's home. He didn't have a phone accessible to him unless he went inside the home, so he decided to drive to a payphone where he then called police. Now, the police eventually arrived at the residence, and at this point, they inspected the area. And what they found is that a window in the back door had been broken. They went inside the home, and they discovered that Charles's mom, Dorothy Donovan, was in her room, dead. She had bled to death from stab wounds. So the coroner eventually determined that Dorothy had been stabbed nearly 30 times, and this was considered to be excessive and very violent. This pointed investigators to the idea that whoever attacked Dorothy probably knew her well. This was something that you often see when the person knows who they're actually taking these actions out on. Now, in addition to this, I would like to state that the stab wounds were all to the upper body. They were to the arms, the chest, and the face, which is also a very personal place to attack somebody. In addition to this, the scene appeared to be staged. There is a pillow placed over Dorothy's head, which usually tends to indicate some sort of remorse, and that the person who carried out the murder likely knew the victim. And so this also pointed towards a personal attack. In addition to this, it looked like the scene was staged because it appeared that Dorothy's body had been left in such a way that suggested she had been sexually assaulted. Now, when the coroner was doing his examination, he didn't find any evidence of a sexual assault whatsoever. So yet again, this made police think that somebody was trying to make it appear as though the motive for this crime was some sort of sexual assault, to point away from other possible motives such as a personal motive. And so this kept leading police back to the son, to Charles. Now, when they showed Charles his mother's body, the first thing he apparently said was, "I can't believe he killed her." Now, this seemed really, really strange to officers at the time. So Charles explained to the police about the hitchhiker. He mentioned that he had picked up this hitchhiker at a Hardee's restaurant on his way home from work. He mentioned that he got into an altercation with him when he tried to get the hitchhiker to leave his car, and that he drove off, and that he now believed that it wasn't, just a random person that was prowling outside of his mom's house. It must have been the hitchhiker, because that would have been the person in the area. And when he started to think about it, he thought that the person looked like or must have been the hitchhiker. That was the only explanation. And police found this story to be very suspicious. It was so convenient that it wasn't believable. And I feel like we can probably understand that to a certain degree, that it seems like such an unbelievable story that a man would randomly pick up a hitchhiker, something he doesn't tend to do. He would give him a short ride and then get into an altercation with him in which he's able to get away even though he's being attacked with a screwdriver, and he manages to drive around away from his house for a few minutes before going back, only to find that that very same hitchhiker has broken into his mom's house, the house where he still lives on the same property, and murdered that mom. Now, it's a very rare kind of story to come across a story like this, and to discover that it might actually be true is very strange. It was indeed an unbelievable story. It's really hard to fault police on this one for thinking that this story was made up, because it just seems so unbelievable. Now, let's continue on though, because there is a lot more to this story. This doesn't get resolved for another 15 years. So if Charles committed the murder, what was his motive? It had already been determined that there was not a sexual assault. Also, something I forgot to mention a couple minutes ago is that there were no valuables missing from the home at all, and Dorothy's purse hadn't even been disturbed, and so police determined that robbery was also not a motive for the break-in and for the murder. And so what they had left was a personal motive. What they ended up discovering is that Dorothy had recently taken out an accidental death insurance policy, and she had named Charles as her beneficiary if something had happened to her. And so, in addition to this, Charles was having some sort of financial problems. Now, I wasn't able to find any evidence specifically of what this was, but from what I was able to kind of glean from what I did see, he had some sort of debt. Nothing said anything was terribly significant, but he did have some sort of debt related to farming, and because of this, they were thinking that Charles wanted to murder his mother in order to get the insurance money to pay off his debts. Now, investigators were also very concerned with Charles because at one point he refused to take a polygraph test. Now, I don't want to go on and on and on about this, so if you guys don't already know, if you haven't seen the video previously, I have done an entire video about polygraph tests. I went into the history and the science and the entire background of the polygraph machine. So if you guys want to know more about polygraph tests and why I am about to say what I'm about to say, I would just go ahead and click in this corner up here. I will leave a link to the video so that you guys can go see that. You can learn a little bit more about my personal opinions on polygraph tests and the evidence as to why that is my personal opinion. And so basically what I'm going to say right now is, just because he refused to take a polygraph test does not mean he's guilty. So the police thought that it was very highly suspicious that he refused to take a polygraph test. I, on the other hand, don't think that that's suspicious at all. So let's move on. So it was early on in the investigation when evidence was discovered that suggested that Charles was not actually the murderer. He was not in the house when the murder took place. So that evidence was a bloody palm print, and it wasn't all completely clear, the palm print wasn't, but a lot of it was. And then there were a number of bloody fingerprints, but those were less clear than the palm print itself. So they heavily relied on the palm print in this case, which is also pretty interesting because you usually hear about the fingerprints and not necessarily about the palm prints, but those actually can be used as well. And so they relied really heavily on that in this case, and they were able to determine that the palm print did not match Charles. And this, remember, is a palm print that was left in blood at the crime scene. So this was blood that had to have been on the murderer's hand, and then he put his hand on something and left that print there in blood. And then, in addition to this, police investigated people who had been at Hardee's that night when Charles had stopped by and picked up the hitchhiker. They had said that there was a man matching the description that Charles gave police in the parking lot asking for rides, and witnesses also actually saw this man getting into Charles's truck. So this started to back up Charles's story. However, police were still pretty suspicious of him. But at this point, they went ahead and had Charles sit down with a sketch artist, and together they compiled what is known as a composite sketch of the suspect. Now, they took this sketch of the suspect and they used it to compile photos of criminals who matched that description, and then they put that into a photo lineup. Now, they had Charles and they had witnesses from the Hardee's restaurant looking at these photo lineups, and Charles and 3 other people from the restaurant who were witnesses all picked the same person from the photo lineup. So they looked into this man a little bit more, and unfortunately, that didn't turn up much either. It ended up being a dead lead, essentially. I am so sorry, guys, but my voice seems to be cracking for some reason. I don't know if I'm getting sick or something, but please bear with me. So they went to visit this man, and when they got there, they realized that this man had a full beard. Now, the time between the actual crime and when they saw this man, who was a possible suspect, there had not been enough time elapsed for a man who had been clean shaven the night of the crime to grow a full beard. So they ended up ruling this man out. In addition to this, he was later ruled out yet again by his palm print and by his DNA. Now, I didn't mention DNA earlier because they didn't find it right away, but eventually what they found is that there was a blood smear on a light switch at the crime scene, and what they were able to determine is that this blood did not belong to Dorothy. They also determined that it did not belong to her son, Charles, and they were able to determine that it also didn't belong to that other possible suspect. Now, they do know that that blood had to have come from the murderer, and what likely happened is that the murderer either cut his hand on the broken window or on the murder weapon itself, and then he got some of his own blood on that light switch as he was leaving the residence. So we're going to fast forward quite a bit of time here. It's now 2005, and the investigative agency on this case, they have sent the DNA sample to an FBI database to be compared to other samples in that database. And surprisingly enough, it was only a week before they found a match. Now, this match came back as a Gilbert Cannon. Cannon already had a pretty long criminal history, and he had been living in Delaware at the time of the murder. So eventually they were able to find him. It took over 2 months before they actually figured out where Gilbert Cannon was, but they finally came across him and they took him in for questioning. And when they interrogated him, they were eventually able to break down what actually happened that night, and he eventually did admit to the murder of Dorothy Donovan. Now, according to Cannon, pretty much everything about Charles's story was true. He had picked him up at Hardee's, they had had an altercation, they had gotten out of the car, and that altercation had continued, and then Charles was able to get back in the car and drive away, and it literally was just a ridiculous coincidence that this man randomly came upon Dorothy's house. Now, he said that he was high on cocaine at the time, and he also said that all he wanted to do after he had been left at that intersection was find a place to sleep it off. And so he wanted to find a home to break in so that he could sleep there overnight. So what he did is he walked down the road and he just kept going. And if he saw a house with lights on, he said that he wasn't going to break into that house because clearly people were in there. So he waited until he found a house that didn't have any lights on whatsoever. And what he found was Dorothy's house. That was the first one he came across that had no lights on. And what I've discovered from people who actually live in that area where this murder took place is that it's actually a pretty rural area, or at least was more rural back then. There were not a lot of houses in the area, so there wouldn't have been that many houses for him to have walked past and to choose from. So he literally went to the first house that he saw that did not have a light on. So he broke into the house, and when he did this, Dorothy woke up and she saw him, and at that point he decided that he had to kill her, and he at one point stated that he was afraid that she might be able to identify him, and, you know, being high, you're not thinking very clearly. And so what he ended up doing is he ended up murdering her, and then he fled the scene. So investigators still weren't sure if Charles was involved in this murder at all. They had thought for a very long time, even though he clearly wasn't the person who actually physically murdered Dorothy, they thought that maybe he had hired the person who did do it. So what they ended up doing is asking Cannon if anyone else was involved in this crime, and he said that it was only him, there was no one else involved, and it just randomly happened that night. And then they revealed to him that the person he killed was actually the mom of the person who picked him up from Hardee's. and he was completely surprised by this, and he said that it was just the strangest coincidence that there was. So Gilbert Cannon was charged with first-degree murder. He ended up pleading guilty to first-degree murder in order to avoid the death penalty, so he ended up being sentenced to life in jail without the chance of parole. So due to Charles's act of kindness that night for a complete stranger, he unfortunately faced the death of his mother and 15 years of being the prime suspect of her murder. Even today, people still talk about how they think that Charles isn't telling the whole story, but that doesn't make any sense because, as we know, Charles told his story. His story hasn't changed, and when the actual murderer was finally found, his story matched up, like word for word, with Charles's story, and he was actually surprised to learn that the person he had murdered that night was the mom of the guy who had picked him up earlier that night. It was just such a random coincidence, and it was truly an unbelievable story, but it ended up being true. It was just the strangest coincidence. So thankfully, in 2006, Cannon had been caught. As I said, he's now serving a life term in prison, and he has no chance of parole. He will die in prison for the murder that he committed of Dorothy Donovan that night. In this case, without that actual forensic evidence, without being able to analyze that evidence and to connect that DNA from the crime scene to another person, what probably would have happened is that Charles probably would have gone to jail for his mother's murder, and he had nothing to do with it. So it's just amazing to see how far science has brought us in, just the past century alone. So I hope that you guys enjoyed today's video. Please remember to remain respectful in the comments down below. As always, all of my sources for my videos are pinned to the very top of the comment section below this video. And if you guys really liked today's video, I'd really appreciate it if you considered hitting that subscribe button down below. I enjoy having all of you guys here, whether you do subscribe or not. Each and every view is like a huge accomplishment for me because it means that these cases are getting attention from someone somewhere, and I think that's really the important thing here. If you guys want any updates about my videos, about any changes to my schedule, you guys can follow me on social media. Mostly on Twitter is where I post updates. All that information is in the description box down below. And I will see you guys again on Monday for a historical mysteries video. And so I will see you then. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and you have a great weekend. Bye everyone.